For most of my life, I never imagined that I would have to prove that my own family farm belonged to me. The property had been in my family for generations, long before the neighborhood around it even existed. My grandfather bought the land when the surrounding area was nothing but open fields, dirt roads, and scattered farmhouses. Over the decades, the town grew around us. New streets appeared, houses were built. Eventually, a massive planned community was developed less than half a mile from our farmhouse. But our farm remained exactly where it had always been. There was an old farmhouse sitting near the center of the property, a weathered red barn behind it, several acres of pasture, a private gravel driveway, and a line of trees separating our land from the newer development. We paid our property taxes every year, maintained our fences, repaired the barn, and continued using the fields. Nobody had ever questioned our ownership. Then the HOA changed management companies, and everything suddenly became different. The first warning arrived in the mail on a Tuesday morning. It was a thick envelope with the HOA's logo printed across the front. Inside was a formal notice stating that the association had identified a portion of my farm as community-controlled property. According to the letter, I was required to stop using the land immediately and provide the HOA with unrestricted access to the area. It also said that certain structures and equipment located on the property were allegedly violating community standards. I read the letter twice because I genuinely thought it had been sent to the wrong person. I called the HOA office and asked to speak with someone who could explain what was happening. A woman from the management company told me that the association had recently reviewed historical subdivision documents and discovered that approximately 6 acres of my farm were supposedly part of the original community plan. I asked her how that was possible when my deed clearly covered the entire farm. She told me that the HOA had documentation supporting its position. I asked her to send me a copy. She said their attorney would provide it if necessary. That was the first moment I became suspicious. If they truly owned the land, why were they refusing to show me the document? 3 days later, I drove to the farm and found 3 men standing near my eastern field. They were wearing safety vests and carrying measuring equipment. Orange flags had been pushed into the ground every few dozen feet. One of the men was measuring from the old fence toward the barn. I walked over and asked what they were doing. One of them said they were contractors hired by the HOA to conduct preliminary work for a future walking trail. I told him he was standing on private property and needed to leave. He looked at the other men, then pulled out a printed map. He told me the area belonged to the HOA. I looked at the map and immediately recognized it. It was an old development planning map from decades ago. It showed roads that were never built and drainage areas that never existed. I told him that map had nothing to do with ownership. He shrugged and said the HOA had instructed them to proceed. I told them to pack up and leave. They eventually did, but before they left, one of the men said something that stayed in my mind. He told me, "The association says this whole section is community property." I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding between me and a contractor. The HOA actually intended to take control of my land. I contacted a property attorney the following morning. He asked me to bring every document I had concerning the farm. I brought my deed, tax records, old surveys, insurance documents, photographs, and even a folder of papers my grandfather had kept in an old metal cabinet. My attorney examined everything carefully. Then he asked me one question: "Do you have the original recorded deed?" I told him I believed I did. He looked through the documents and found it. The deed was more than 50 years old, and the legal description was extremely detailed. It referenced neighboring parcels, an old creek, a large oak tree, and a boundary line that followed the original fence. Most importantly, the 6 acres the HOA claimed were clearly included in the property description. My attorney immediately ordered a title search. What came back was even more damaging to the HOA. There was no deed transferring the disputed land to the developer. There was no deed transferring it to the HOA. There was no recorded easement giving the association the broad rights it claimed. There wasn't even a recorded document suggesting that my family had ever surrendered ownership. The HOA's entire argument appeared to be based on a development planning map. My attorney explained that a planning document could show someone's intentions, but it didn't automatically transfer property. Ownership required an actual legal conveyance. I thought that would be enough to end the situation. It wasn't. The HOA sent me another letter, this time signed by their attorney. The language was much more aggressive. They claimed that my family had misunderstood the historical property boundaries and that the association reserved the right to take legal action if I continued blocking access. They also demanded that I remove several pieces of farm equipment from the disputed section. I called my attorney immediately. He told me not to argue with them directly and not to move anything. Instead, we sent a formal response demanding the legal basis for their claim. We specifically asked for the deed, easement, conveyance, or recorded document that transferred ownership. The HOA attorney responded with the same old planning map. My attorney couldn't believe it. He wrote back and asked, "Is this the only document upon which your client bases its claim of ownership?" The HOA attorney didn't respond for nearly 2 weeks. During that time, the HOA held a community meeting. Several homeowners told me afterward that the board had presented the disputed land as though it were already theirs. They apparently planned to build a walking path through my pasture, install benches, plant trees, and create a small recreational area. They had even discussed removing one section of my fence. Some homeowners believed the land was community property because the HOA president had shown them the same map. I attended the next meeting and waited until the floor was open. I stood up and asked the president one question. "Can you show everyone the deed proving that the HOA owns my land?" She became visibly uncomfortable. She said the association had legal documentation. I repeated the question, "Where is the deed?" She said the board wasn't required to discuss legal strategy publicly. I told her I wasn't asking about legal strategy. I was asking about ownership. The room became silent. Then I placed a copy of my original deed on the table. I pointed to the legal description. I explained that the disputed 6 acres were included in my family's recorded property. I showed the date of the deed and the county recording information. Then I placed the HOA's map beside it. The difference was obvious. The HOA map showed their proposed boundary. My deed showed the actual legal description. The HOA president tried to argue that the development map represented the original intended boundary. My attorney, who had accompanied me, calmly explained that intentions didn't override recorded ownership. The board's attorney finally admitted that the association did not possess a deed to the property. That was the moment everything changed. We filed a legal action seeking an injunction preventing the HOA from entering the farm. The court reviewed the deed, title records, historical surveys, and the HOA's documents. The judge specifically asked the association's attorney whether there was any recorded document transferring the disputed land from my family to the developer or HOA. There wasn't. The HOA tried to argue that the planning map created an implied community right. But the judge wasn't persuaded. The court ruled that the property belonged to me and that the HOA had no ownership interest in the disputed section. The association was ordered to remove its stakes and markers and prohibited from entering the property without permission. But the investigation didn't end there. While reviewing the HOA's records, my attorney discovered that the same outdated planning map had been used in several other property disputes. At least 4 homeowners had been told that portions of their lots were community property. One homeowner had even paid thousands of dollars to move a fence because the HOA told him the original boundary was incorrect. Once the court ruling became known, those homeowners started examining their own deeds. One by one, the HOA's claims began falling apart. The management company had apparently been using an old development map as a shortcut instead of verifying individual property records. Whether it was negligence or something more deliberate was something the HOA would have to determine itself. But for me, the most important thing was simple. My family's farm was still ours. The following weekend, I walked through the field where the HOA had placed its orange stakes. I pulled each one out of the ground and threw them into the back of my truck. Then I repaired the old fence where the contractors had moved it. That evening, I stood beside the barn and looked across the pasture. The HOA had assumed that because the neighborhood was newer, larger, and more organized, it somehow had more authority than an old family deed. They were wrong. They had a logo. They had attorneys. They had maps. But my family had something much more powerful. We had the original deed. And sometimes, the document everyone forgot about is the document that can destroy an entire scheme.